Last night we began discussing the early period of Muslim leadership and Khilafah, and tonight I was to discuss a different subject altogether as a continuation, but I left some last night, so I just want to wrap that up very quickly. Just a few points of clarification though. Last night I did mention that the legacy of discrimination and that sense where Muslims confused the idea of the Prophet ﷺ being an Arab versus Islam as a universal faith that Allah established from the time of Adam has lingered on to this day, where a lot of nations where the majority are Muslims, there tends to be this distinction between an Arab and a non-Arab. And I mentioned in passing that to this day you will find that in many Arab nations non-Arabs feel discriminated against and treated as lesser even if they share the same faith. Now, this is not based on any feedback from anyone, but just my own thoughts. I thought I should clarify that when I say that, I do not mean every individual Arab discriminates against non-Arabs. What I meant is, as a government, as a policy, the rules and the policy promote pan-Arabism versus pan-Islamicism. And therefore, for example, you will find that in nations such as this that are predominantly non-Muslim, if you live here for 3, 4, 5 years and pay taxes and work hard and contribute, the country acknowledges and allows you citizenship. But in many of these Arab nations, you could move there and live all your life, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but you will still not be allowed to live there and become part of that citizenship and nationality. There may be whatever reason there are, but if we claim to be Muslims and role models, then our inspiration and our leadership must inspire that. But if we don't find examples of those in our history, and we find the converse where leadership indicated that Arabs are superior to non-Arabs, then that legacy remains in our ethos. I've also received a number of questions asking to clarify certain things, such as, for example, the Shias are often told that it was the Shia who invited Imam al-Hussein and then killed him. So how do we respond to that? Or the issue of the fast of Ashura and so on. Now, if I begin responding to this, then obviously it will take time from the discussion. So I will leave this, and inshallah on the very last lecture when we do a conclusion, if there is time, as part of tying loose ends, we will cover anything like this. Last night I said that just as major points and highlights from the observance of the Shia, as well as academics and historians who are not even Muslims in some cases, they have critiqued the early caliphate, and I identified 3 issues of concern that were raised in the first caliphate and the second caliphate. Now, with regards to the third caliphate, I will not discuss in detail because, as I said, I was to do this last night, and I just want to wrap it up very quickly. What historians have observed with regards to the Khilafah of Uthman bin Affan is that, as I mentioned last night, that it appears that if Abu Ubaidah had not predeceased Umar, then he was to be the third caliph. So there was now a need for a third candidate. And the Caliph Umar decided, instead of appointing one individual just like he was appointed by Abu Bakr, he would set up a shura. Some of the historians said this was in part because the Caliph Umar was trying to Islamicize that Qurayshi Khilafat that had come into place when his predecessor Abu Bakr had brought the Quraysh after Fath Makkah and given them positions of command. And so what the Caliph Umar was trying to do was to say, the Quraysh are now here to stay. They have taken positions of authority, but let us Islamicize this government further by introducing some Quranic principles, such as, for example, the Quran tells the Prophet that consult your companions. And so this idea of shura should be introduced, where Muslims do things through consultation. The other thing he was trying to introduce was this idea of sabiqa, that those who became Muslims earlier should be given some preference over those who became Muslims after. Now, he therefore decided he would set up a shura and put 6 people in this consultative council, and from this 6, one of them should be the caliph. And these 6 individuals that he chose was Uthman bin Affan, Zubair bin al-Awam, Talha, Abdul Rahman bin Auf, there was Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas, the father of Umar Asad, and Ali bin Abi Talib. Now, he then put some rules around how this would work. He said, if the group divides in opinion into 2 groups, 3 and 3, then my son Abdullah bin Umar will decide from which group the caliph should be chosen, and preference should be given to the group in which Abdul Rahman bin Auf is present. And if all agree on one caliph and 2 disagree, then they must accept that caliph, otherwise they should be beheaded. Now, historians as well as Imam Ali alayhi salam, he comments on this and complains to Abdullah ibn Abbas as to why it was unfair right from the start in how it was set up. The reason it was unfair is as follows. Abdul Rahman bin Auf was Uthman's brother-in-law. He was married to Uthman's sister, and his vote was given extra weight. Sa'ad bin Abi Waqqas was related to Abdul Rahman bin Auf. Talha belonged to the tribe of Taim, which was the same tribe that Abu Bakr belonged to, and therefore he was opposed to Ali. Abdullah bin Umar, who would have a say if there was an equal division, did not even pledge allegiance to Ali after, so he was opposed to Ali. So really in all these 6, the only person who sided with Ali was Zubair. And Zubair removed his vote and said, I withdraw my name in favor of Ali at the time. Zubair was very loyal to Ali, even though he fought against him in the Battle of Jamal. And he was related to Imam Ali because Zubair's mother and Imam Ali's father were siblings. Zubair's mother was the sister of Abdullah, the Prophet's father, and Abu Talib and Hamza. She was the daughter of Abdul Muttalib. So they were cousins actually, Imam Ali and Zubair. But Zubair's wife was the sister of Aisha. And Zubair had a son called Abdullah who was very close to his aunt. And he was severely against Ali bin Abi Talib. And he drove his father against Ali, and that is why we have in Nahjul Balagha that Imam Ali has a saying. He says, Zubair continued to be a member of our family until his wretched son Abdullah came forward. So the whole shura was set up in such a manner that there was no chance that Ali bin Abi Talib could have won. This is the opinion not of the Shia but of Imam Ali himself, and you will find his arguments in Nahjul Balagha. And Ibn Abi al-Hadid al-Mu'tazili has explained this in detail in his sharh of Nahjul Balagha. What the historians say is that first of all, Uthman by his nature was averse to bloodshed. He did not really show a lot of interest in military fight, and he often was excused by the Prophet himself from war. And this was an important quality for any leader to have. And Wilfred Medlang, that I mentioned yesterday, says that at no time did he display any qualities of public leadership. In fact, out of these 6 candidates, he was the only one whom neither the Prophet nor the first 2 caliphs ever positioned as a leader or commander of any army or any expedition. So the advantage of Uthman from the historian perspective at least is that he was an Umayyad, and therefore he would have had the support of the Quraysh in continuing the Khilafat and leadership. And as I mentioned last night, Imam Ali was adamant that if he would take Khilafat, he would not follow the Seerah of the Shaykhain. He would only follow Quran and Seerah of the Prophet. Now, at a high level, the 3 issues that we were going to talk about with regards to the Khilafat of Uthman was 1, nepotism, the idea of family members being given positions of authority. The second was misappropriation of wealth, large sums of public treasury being given to family members. And the third was mistreatment of some of the Sahabas, in particular Abu Dhar al-Ghifari. Now, I have read versions of the story of Abu Dharr Ghafari and Uthman and Muawiyah from a Sunni perspective. And in my humble opinion, again, it is somewhat revisionist of history in suggesting that there was no discord, and the Caliph Uthman requested the Sahaba Abu Dharr to move to Damascus, and Muawiyah asked him to come back, and then that sort of a thing. But when you read all the reports of history, it was a harsh treatment. He was exiled, he was sent to Rabza where he did not want to go, and he died in isolation. So there is enough historic evidence to suggest that him, as well as other companions, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and others are mentioned as well, who were mistreated. With regards to nepotism, there is a lot of names and incidents to show family members that were given positions of authority, governorship, and so on, and we cannot get into all of this. But if you take a book like the one I mentioned by Madlang, Succession to Muhammad, you will find full references, names, and all the details. Misappropriation of wealth as well, there is lots of names, and the figures we're seeing is all companions of the Prophet who had very little at the time of the Prophet. When they die or pass away after the time of Uthman, they're leaving sums of wealth like 100,000 dinars, 150,000 dinars, thousands of camels and slaves and villages and farmlands, and and I can't unfortunately go into all this, but what I tried to do was try to say, we hear numbers like 100,000 dinars, 10,000 dirhams. What does this mean really? So, and I may be wrong here, but this is the approach I took. I tried to find out what is a dinar and a dirham. A dinar is 4.2 grams of pure gold. A dirham is about 2.98 grams of pure silver, or 3 grams of silver. If you take the current price of gold at about $40 to $50 a gram, 4.25 grams is about $200 for a dinar. So if a Sahaba dies leaving 100,000 dinars, in today's estimate, that means from very basic, humble, poor life before the Prophet, by the time the Caliph Uthman comes to power, he's dying leaving $20 million, $37 million. We're talking of millions of dollars. And this is besides the 10,000 sheep and 1,000 camels and 100 horses, and leaving for the wives 80,000 dinars as inheritance, and so on and so forth. So something was going wrong with the ummah. And when we question the adala of the Sahaba, it is not again because the Shias like to curse the Sahaba. It is because as Muslims, we cannot move forward unless we acknowledge we have a problem and we begin to talk about this. We can talk about it respectfully, but we nonetheless have to talk about it because these are historic facts. We cannot create sanctities around individuals and say we cannot talk about it. As Shias, we look at things as honestly as possible as we can. And as I said, the Shia argument and weight and strength is that we're not looking at Shia sources here. We're looking at sources that all Muslims use. And it's not to disparage, but to say we have to honestly look and not assume that everybody who was of a particular integrity before the Prophet was the same after the Prophet ﷺ passed away. Ziyad bin Thabit, for example, when he passed away, he left so much gold and silver that hammers had to be used to break the gold and silver just to distribute it to his heirs. How did these people get all this money, and where did this come from? These need to be looked at. The Battle of Jamal was fought by Talha, Zubair, and Aisha against Imam Ali. You cannot just go to battle and take tens of thousands of people. You need to feed the army, you need to equip the army, you need horses, you need weapons, you need... Who was funding all this? These are the kind of things that you look at honestly as a historian, right? You look at it today as well. When people look at ISIS and they say, this cannot be just a bunch of ragtag individuals who just stood up and said, we're going to go fight and take over Syria and Iraq. Look at the kind of vehicles and trucks they're driving. They're driving brand new trucks that are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Look at the kind of equipment mounted on these trucks. Somebody must be paying for this. Where is the funding coming from, right? This is the argument that constantly comes about. So it's one thing to believe in something just from faith. It's another thing to look at it with open eyes and then study history and find out where Muslims had pitfalls and where they went wrong. Now, in terms of the policies of Imam Ali when he took over Khilafat and how he tried to reverse these things, you will see that, for example, first of all, he refused to follow the seerah of the Shaykhain. Secondly, Imam Ali gave a lot of preference to the non-Arabs. The Persians absolutely loved him. Right? You will see, for example, a large number of followers of Mukhtar in taking the revenge of Imam Hussein were Persians. And the reason the Persians followed him and became Alawi is because of their love for Ali bin Abi Talib, because they saw him as being very fair in saying, I will appoint people and treat people on the basis of taqwa, not on the basis of their ethnicity. So, if you look at Nahjul Balagha as well, I talked about, for example, the collection of zakat and the policy of the first caliph where he went to war to collect zakat and this hurub ridda. You read Nahjul Balagha and see Imam Ali's letter to his tax collectors. You will see a complete opposite. He gives very clear instructions to his tax collectors and says, when you go out and collect taxes, don't come in showing yourself as being superior to them. Don't intimidate the Muslims that you're collecting zakat from. If they tell you they don't have any zakat to give, leave them alone. Don't insist and say you have zakat and you have to give. If they say they have zakat to give and there are animals in a pen and they're going to give you an animal from what they have, don't go into that place where the animals are. You stay out and let them bring the animal to you. If they bring the animal to you, don't say, no, this animal is defective, I'm going to take that animal. He asks them to be completely accommodating and sympathetic and empathizing and respecting the integrity of the Muslims. Right? So you see these sort of reversals. There is another khutbah in Nahjul Balagha where he talks about what happened at the time of Uthman, and he says, I swear by Allah, even if I find women that were married and their mahar was given with unlawful money from Baytul Mal, I will take that money back and have them divorced. But I will not tolerate money being misappropriated from the wealth of Muslims. Now, these sort of comments from Imam Ali suggests that he saw problems and that he was trying to rectify this, but obviously he was occupied with battles for the 3.5 years that he ruled one after the other, and not everything was put into place. So this is in summary of what we were trying to discuss with the early Khilafat. If you can recite Salawat ala Muhammad wa ala. Now, we fast forward to a much later period, closer to our times. And we say that the Umayyads and Abbasids, of course, did not rule according to any Islamic principle as such. The Umayyads ruled based on a model of government that was Byzantium, and then the Abbasids ruled on what was a Sassanid form of ruling and government. But they used Islam to justify their dominance over Muslims, and they showed some un-Islamic behavior, such as, for example, they would institute the punishment or hudud of Islam on the laity and common people, but they themselves were above the law, which you see even today in societies that will punish the lay common people with Islamic punishment, chop their hands off and so on, but their own royal family will commit the most horrendous crimes when they travel overseas, and they are covered and nobody talks about that. The other thing that the Umayyads Abbasids did was, the Prophet ﷺ was spreading Islam through ambassadors. He would send ambassadors to different countries and invite them to Islam. But what they would do is they would send armies and invade those lands, taking a cue perhaps from predecessors who invaded, for example, Egypt and Syria and so on. And part of this was not to spread Islam, but it was to colonize so that they could take the natural resources from those lands and they could collect tax and jizya from those places, which is really what the colonialists did as well. When the Banu Abbas came to fall in 1258, the Khilafat ended, and that was replaced by a Sultanate. And this Sultanate was largely the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire that came after Banu Abbas were the Turks, which would be modern day today Turkey. And by that time now, the Muslim Empire was not held by one dynasty only. There was on one side the Ottoman Empire. There were in Persia there were the Safavi that were Shia. Then in India you had the Mughal Empire. You had the Fatimids and so on and so forth. So the Muslim empire was breaking up and it wasn't really one. But for the most part, the large majority that defined themselves as Sunni, they were looking up to this Ottoman empire that were the Turks. And even though there was this idea that we are under the rule of a khilafah, that old system of the Khalifa being the representative of the Prophet ﷺ was now fading away, and it was becoming more secular in a sense, but Islam continued to be the more vital social and political force. Now, during the 18th century, the Sultanate began having two issues. One, there was a stagnation and a degeneration in the Muslim Khilafat or Caliphate in the Ottoman Empire. The other thing was that Western civilization was now growing. So now there were revivalist movements, and Muslims were now concerned that we need to respond to Western civilization, and Muslims need to come out of all the stagnation that they are in. And this began all the different types of reforms and revivals with good intention or bad intention. You had, for example, the Wahhabi movement that was led by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, inspired by Ibn Taymiyyah. You had, for example, in Africa, you had the Grand Sanusi of Libya, you had the Mahdi of Sudan. In India, in the Indian subcontinent, you had Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, and you had Shah Waliullah Dehlavi, and so on. And these were all trying to reform Islam. Now, by the time you came to the late 19th century, early 20th century, there was an uprising in the Arab world that was called An-Nahda. An-Nahda means the awakening, or the renaissance, or the rebirth. And I like to think of it as the first Arab Spring. Okay? And it began in Egypt, and then it quickly moved to the other areas that the Ottoman Empire ruled over, including Lebanon, Syria, and other places. Now, what was the cause of this Nahda and this uprising? There were several. One was to rise against Western powers, because they were seeing colonialism coming into play. Like, for example, Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798. So Muslims started getting concerned with this idea of Western powers coming into Muslim lands. The other was that this realization that Muslim societies are now stagnating. And the third was there was a lot of discontentment within the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire was trying to reform itself, and so it began a widespread reform that were called Tanzimat. And we can't get into all those details, but if you Google Tanzimat, Ottoman Empire, you'll find a whole Wikipedia article on this. By 1922, the Turkish nationalists themselves disbanded the Ottoman Empire, and the Muslim Khilafat officially came to an end in 1924. If I'm not mistaken, it was the 3rd of March, 1924. Now, let's talk a little bit about what happened then. As soon as these problems happened, Muslims at first began thinking this was a punishment from Allah, and there must be a reason why our Khilafat that has lasted since the time of the Prophet has broken up. Immediately, Muslims broke into two groups. There was one group that we will refer to as the modernists, who tried to reform Islam. There was another group that we will refer to as fundamentalists, because that's what historians refer to them. We might not agree with the term, but this is what it was. Now let's very quickly now Islamic fundamentalism. When colonialism began to spread and the Khilafat collapsed, the other side of Muslims, so Muslims broke into two groups. There was one that said we now have to reform Islam. Let's go and see what Europe is doing. Let's come back and let's implement the Western model and reform Islam. Some of them took the other extreme and said we don't need to reform Islam, we need to revive Islam. And the problem is we have neglected Quran and we have neglected Hadith. And Muslims, the problem is they've become materialistic and there is moral decadence. And we now need to revive and bring the spirit of Islam back. Surprisingly, the first person and one of the pioneers of this was Muhammad Rashid Rida, the student of Abdu, who was the student of Jamaluddin Afghani. So what happened was when Abdu died, Rashid Rida took over the role of Abdu as a leading figure in that movement of Islamic theology revival and reform. And in the last 20 years of his life, he changed from being a reformer and a modernist to being more fundamentalist and arguing for opposition to the West. And so he witnessed a lot of things regarding the European powers that really bothered him. And he is known to have said that the only language the West understands is power and violence, which they inflict on their subjects whom they colonize. And so he used Quran tafsir and sources in Hadith to justify his theology of resistance, and he distanced himself from his mentors, from Abdu and Jamaluddin Afghani. He argued that what we need is an all-out war against the enemy. He opposed the Sufis because they believed in detachment from the world and were not participating in society. And he began calling himself a Salafi, taking the word that a Salafi is someone who follows the earliest companions of the Prophet, and in a sense calling for a puritanical Islam, to say the only way we will find pure Islam is to go right back to the earliest days of the Prophet. That would be the purest Islam that we can find. Now, he had a student called Hassan al-Banna. Hassan al-Banna took over from Rashid Rida, and he argued the same points, and he formed, to make some practical steps towards reviving Islam and taking Muslims back to original Islam. He formed an organization in Egypt called Ikhwanul Muslimin, Islamic Brotherhood, which was the most powerful and popular political party of Muslims in the 20th century. And the first issue that the Muslim fundamentalists ignored was that scientific and technological progress is not the result of any specific dogma or religion or faith. It is merely human progress. And therefore, not everything that is Western has to necessarily be anti-Islam. The second thing that these revivalists or fundamentalists, as they are being referred to, the second mistake they made was that most Muslims were now being born and raised in these non-Muslim societies. Gone were the days when Muslims were only born and raised in Muslim societies, where you could speak of us Muslims versus the West. A lot of Muslims were being born in non-Muslim societies and growing up in those cultures. So the lines of us versus them were not so black and white. Yet another issue was that there were many systems now in place that were becoming global and were not isolated. So keeping away from them simply meant loss for Muslims. As an example, the banking system. As an example, the political system, where you had things like democracy. As an example, university education both for males and females. These things were happening globally in the non-Muslim world. Muslims had two choices. One is to find a response to this that was Islamic, to say we will have banking as well, but we will have an Islamic version. We will have democracy as well, but it will be led by Islamic authorities. We will have university education for men and women, but it will be within an Islamic framework. Instead, the argument was that no, anything from the West was bad, and we need to shun it and take back to the life and the times when the Prophet ﷺ lived. And this set Muslims back quite a bit, and it would take decades for them to catch up. Now, this was not the first time it was happening. It had happened during the Ottoman Empire's time. During the time of the Ottomans and other times, Islam, we are told, was at one point the leaders of civilization, and all the scientists and minds and brains came from the Muslims. How did it happen that Muslims declined? One of the reasons for the decline of Muslims is that people from non-Muslim societies, from Europe, when they interacted with the Arabs, they learned Arabic and they translated the works of the Muslims from Arabic to Latin. Even the works that Muslims had translated from Greek to Arabic, they translated it from Arabic to Latin. Muslims, however, were told that it is kufr to learn the language of the kuffar and mushrikeen. You should only learn Arabic. So now, whatever improvements in science that the non-Muslims were making, those were not coming to the Muslims, because Muslims were not learning Latin to translate it back to Arabic for the majority, or for whatever languages in the lands of the Muslims, whether it was Turkish or Urdu or Farsi, it was not coming back. Another example, Muslims, when the printing press was introduced, because back in the time writing took a lot of time, and if you wanted to make a copy of a book, you had to go to a place where you'd go to a scribe and pay him money, and he would copy the book for you. Now, when the printing press was invented, these scribes were afraid that they're going to go out of business because nobody's going to go to them. So they instigated partly this, but they came up with this idea that the Arabic script is sacred. And in those days when you printed, the printing press was, you'd set up those letters and models, right? And you'd be stamping. There would be stamp printing. So they said, look, when you're stamping, you are hitting How can you slap on the Quran? You cannot print the Quran because that is disrespect to the Quran. So Quran has to be handwritten only. The Christians, though, were very quickly printing the Bible, translating it to Arabic and spreading it, right? The Muslims were saying it's haram to use a print. So what they did was, they allowed printing presses in their lands, and they did not allow Muslims to use those printing presses, but they allowed non-Muslims to do so. And even when they later came to the idea that now we will print the Quran, they said we will hire non-Muslims to print the Quran, but a Muslim should not disrespect the Quran. You know, this was the kind of mindset and leadership that Muslims had. Now, fundamentalists essentially limited themselves to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. What happened was, they failed to see that Islam did not start with the Prophet in Arabia. Islam started from the time of Adam. Islam was the religion of God, a universal faith for all humanity through all times. And therefore, they did not distinguish Arab culture and the time of the Prophet from Islam itself as the actual teaching of the Quran. If they would have seen things other ways, then what they would have concluded is that if we expose ourselves to the culture of other communities, not only will it change our perspective, but they will realize the beauty of Islam. And the real beauty of Islam lies in the fact that you're able to infuse it into all cultures and societies with the same core principles. So the Afghani or the Malaysian or the Chinese or the Russian or the American does not have to dress like an Arab, does not have to eat Arabic food, does not have to behave in a particular manner to be a Muslim. They can keep their own culture, they can keep their own language, but you can still introduce the fundamental principles of Islam, principles such as monotheism and belief in one God, principles such as social and economic justice, principles such as pious leadership, that our leaders should have taqwa, and so on and so forth. Now, I mentioned Hassan al-Banna, who set up this Ikhwan al-Muslimin. Hassan al-Banna also read Muhammad Abdu at first because his father was a student of Abdu. Not only was he a student of Rashid Rida, but his father was a student of Abdu. Banna was convinced of the argument of Rida, but he had other reasons that also caused him to take this fundamentalist approach. One was he saw that Muslims were morally depraved now and falling back because they were imitating the Westerners in their lifestyle. The other thing was that he saw certain things like the destruction of Palestine. And he was dismayed with this idea that there was a lot of hypocrisy in the West, where on one hand the United States spoke of human rights, on the other hand they treated the Palestinians in this manner. And these sort of galvanized and, you know, cemented his idea that the West is the enemy. Banna was assassinated in 1949. When he was assassinated, his position was taken over by another individual who is the person I really want to talk about before I conclude tonight. And this was somebody called Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb is regarded by Western scholars to be the father of modern terrorism. But is he the father of modern terrorism? Perhaps, in the opinion of some. He is an inspiration to many others who do not subscribe to terrorism. Sayyid Qutb was born in 1906 and he was hanged by the Egyptian government in 1966. He was the most significant member. Now, it's a very interesting journey Sayyid Qutb had. Sayyid Qutb was originally a very modern man. He used to write novels, fiction novels. He studied literature. And then he worked for the Ministry of Education in Egypt. And they sent him to the United States for 2 years to study the education system in the American society and bring ideas back that could be implemented in the Egyptian education system. In the 2 years that he lived there, he witnessed American society. But his experience was very different from those of the reformers like Sir Sayyid and Jamaluddin Afghani and Allama Iqbal. His was completely the opposite. He was shocked to see how people lived in the West, and he thought they were the most depraved of all people, absolutely immoral. So he came back and wrote a paper on what the America that I saw, or the America I have seen. And in it he describes all the things he saw in America, and he describes, for example, the American woman in graphic detail of how shameless she is and how she dresses almost naked. And he uses this statement and says, I saw in the West men and women, they mix with each other like animals. These are his terms. He says, whether you go watch a boxing match or you go to the church, they mix with each other like animals. This was his opinion, of course. Now, when he came back to Egypt, he joined Ikhwan al-Muslimin and he took over from Banna. And he was in constant strife with the Egyptian government that was more secular. So he was in and out of prison all the time. He was put in prison for 10 years, and in prison he wrote a tafsir that was called Fi Dhilal al-Quran, in the shade of the Quran. And this is very popular now amongst the Salafis as well. They use this tafsir quite a bit. But when he was released in 1964, he wrote his magnum opus, his greatest work. It is called Al-Ma'alim fi Tariq, and it is translated in English as Milestones. If you search for Milestones of Sayyid Qutb, you will find it even online. This was his political and religious manifesto, in which he talked about how Muslims need to address issues. He was finally hanged 2 years after in 1966, because Al-Azhar University as well declared him to be a munharif and a deviant and so on. Now, I want you to observe that the arguments that Sayyid Qutb presented at first are very valid, and that no Muslim would disagree. Okay. Now, the solution to all the problems, Sayyid Qutb argued, was Islam. It was only God's religion that could and must dismantle the West from its position of authority and its dominance in the world as a force that spreads evil and corruption. But now the question was, how do you practically go about doing this? You've come up with a very nice plan that the problem is corruption, and that Islam is meant to save the souls and offer salvation to people. This was God's plan. He created humans for that. But the corruption that is spreading is causing Islam to diminish, and it's going to spread on the earth like wildfire, and therefore this jahala has to be reversed. Now, his solution to this was that there is only two ways to do it. Sorry, there's only one way to do it. And it is at this point that now Sayyid Qutb now goes down a slippery slope, which now leads us to a free fall into the abyss of radicalism. In his book, The Milestones, he says there is a two-pronged approach, preaching and combat. However, preaching will not work for the West. And these are his words. He says, the abolition of man-made laws cannot be achieved only through preaching. Those who have usurped the authority of God and are oppressing God's creatures are not going to give up their power merely through preaching, because he's watching the colonialists as well. He's saying you can go preaching till you go blue in the face. These colonialists are not going to go. The only language they know is force, because they came in with force, they invaded us, they took power by force. We're going to have to use power to fight them back. Then he goes on to say, Islam cannot accept any compromise with Jahiliyyah, either in its concept or its modes of living derived from this concept. Either Islam has to remain or Jahiliyyah has to remain. Islam cannot and accept to a situation where there is half Islam and half Jahiliyyah. These are Sayyid Qutb's words as well. So you can see that what Sayyid Qutb is calling for is this momentous battle between Islam and the rest. Now, where he is naive is the fact that he is not seeing that what he is suggesting is now a perpetual battle between Muslims and non-Muslims. What he is suggesting is jihad at a global scale that will never end. How do you prevent jihad from becoming the status quo for Muslims, so that that is their primary mission in life, that we just have to keep fighting and fighting the enemy until we die? You see, what he fails to recognize is that the Prophet ﷺ, whenever he had an option to choose between battle and peace, he always chose peace. Even when the odds were against him, like at Hudaybiyah, and that is, in all the battles, Allah does not say this was a great victory for you, Fathum Mubin. But when he signs a treaty that is against the favor of Islam at face value, then Allah says, Inna fatahna laka fatham mubina. We have given you an open and great victory. So he fails to realize this. He also fails to realize that the Prophet ﷺ would send ambassadors to other nations. He wouldn't go and attack and invade and forcefully change them. Even when the Christians of Najran refused to change, they set a pact in where the Muslims would offer them protection and they would pay a tax. But it wasn't you have to, otherwise we compel you or we kill you. Now, the Prophet had an option to choose between whenever he had an option to choose between war and peace, he chose the latter. However, the early leaders of the Muslims, the caliphs who ruled over Islam, they showed the opposite. They invaded lands and took power. And this is exactly the reality we see with all the groups that commit acts of terror in the name of Islam today. If you read the language of all these terrorist groups who do it in the name of Islam, you will see they talk about how a Muslim has to be perpetually in jihad, and that jihad never ends. You live and breathe for jihad. They draw this inspiration directly from books such as Sayyid Qutb's. Now, at what point do we disagree with Sayyid Qutb? We might agree up to this point with Sayyid Qutb that we have a duty and obligation to spread Islam, and we have a duty and obligation to make sure that corruption ends and we fight it. When Sayyid Qutb was asked, is it permissible to kill innocent civilians? His response was as follows. He said, it is preferable not to harm innocent civilians, and that would be the ideal situation if we could avoid it. However, because the Quran says, al-fitnatu ashaddu min al-qatl, mischief and corruption is worse than killing. If it comes to that, then it comes to that. And it is at this point where now these revivalists who wanted to purify Islam begin losing the majority of the Muslims. Because now the majority of the Muslims says, hold on now this is not acceptable. This argument now doesn't hold water. I want to tell you something very interesting. Scholars have said that Ayatollah Khomeini found inspiration in the readings and works of Sayyid Qutb. And Osama bin Laden also found inspiration from Sayyid Qutb. And Ayman Zawahiri also found inspiration from Sayyid Qutb. Now, all these days that I've been talking about Orthodox Islam, I have been saying that the Tashayyu' perspective emphasizes adala. And in fact, one of the sisters sent me a comment that I think was very nice. She said to me that, look, when you were saying in the early days that the Shias have something that insulates them from being radicalized, it was being misunderstood and offending our Sunni brothers and sisters. She said to me, perhaps instead of saying the Shias, you should say the Shia ideology has something in its principles that insulates from radicalization. And I really like that, and I think that is really a very fair correction. Why? Because having something in your ideology does not mean you practice it. If a Shia doesn't understand his aqidah, he could still commit acts of violence. So if you can keep that in mind, even in the lectures that I've said before, that when I'm saying this idea of adala and imama insulating us from being radicalized, I'm talking of the principles of tashayyu and not necessarily every Shia having it in their blood, because they have to understand their aqidah to practice it. What is the difference between Khomeini and Osama bin Laden if both of them were inspired by Sayyid Qutb? Why is it that Osama bin Laden could justify what he did for 9/11 if we say it was him who did it, but Ayatollah Khomeini could never have justified that and said even killing innocent civilians was justified, right? The reason is because the moment he would do that from a Shia perspective, he loses legitimacy as a scholar and an individual. Because this idea of adala is stressed in the Shia madhab. In Shia madhab, the caliph cannot be ghair adil. A sahaba is not a sahaba if he is not adil. The leader of the ummah has to be adil. The imam has to be adil. His imama is violated if he is not adil. And this imam being adil comes right down to the imam of salat. The person leading salat has to be adil. And this is found only in the madhab of tashayyu. And this is the point we're trying to say, that some of these ideas, if they were brought into the ummah, then these would save us from our enemies being able to prey upon those who could be radicalized. If, for example, Sayyid Qutb was talking to a society that strongly believed in this concept of adala that is understood by the Shias from their imams, it would have been impossible for him to convince anyone of this statement, that because the Quran says corruption is worse than killing, therefore we prefer not to kill innocent, but if they have to be killed, then it's okay for the spread of Islam. There's no way he could have justified this. Right? And this is what we're trying to say, that when you insist on adala, then you insist on an adil imam, and that brings in the idea of an imama and the idea of a leadership that is inspired divinely and that comes directly through succession from the Prophet ﷺ. Now, I want to end by saying that unfortunately, amongst the Shias today, we are witnessing the same problem, particularly Muslims and Shias living in the West. All these nights that I have been discussing, I have been critical of Sunni Islam. Why? Because I have been saying that Orthodox Islam is missing some ingredients, and these ingredients are the ingredients of adala and imama. And in order to prove this point, I've had to discuss the history of early Islam and question a lot of things in order to bring this perspective that the ummah that we see as a majority are missing these values. Having said that, when I look at the Shia as well, particularly living in the West, I find that the same tendencies of when we disagree or when we sense our community is in turmoil and it needs reform or revival, we immediately break into two groups again. And again, there is two extremes. Either we become a group that is very liberal-minded and very pluralistic in its ideas, that says, we need to imitate the West, we need to shun a lot of things that we do as Muslims, we need to change how we practice our faith and rituals, we need to question some of the laws of Sharia, and we need to distance ourselves from marja'iyat and taqleed. These are old men living in dusty towns and alleyways who have no idea what we have to deal with, and we need to take things in our control. We do not wish to be patronized, and we from here onwards will figure the way ourselves. These are now the modernists, the reformists, the Mu'tazilites, right? The Sarsayyids. Then we have the other side, where you have the Shia saying, hold on, the problem is not this, the problem is we have stopped following the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. So we shun philosophy, we shun irfan, we shun this, we take a very akhbari stand, and we emphasize fada'il, masa'ib, we detach from everyone else, we are the chosen people, everyone else is bad, the Sunnis are bad, don't eat their food, don't marry them, don't attach with them, and we take the other extreme. Now someone might ask this question and say, well, if the Shias have this same problem, then are you missing adala and imama as well? The answer to that is no, we're not missing adala and imama, but either we have forgotten its importance, or we have failed to see its link in relation to what we have today. So for example, we have failed to see the connection between marja'iyya and taqleed with imama. So now we question it. But if we see that continuity that we have had, an unbroken continuity, which many Muslims do not have, then we begin to value what role it plays and how we have survived despite being a minority because of having these values. It is until we appreciate the values of adala and imama and the gold mine we are sitting on that we will understand the manhaj of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and we will resolve problems, whether we are Shias or Sunnis, through a path of moderation that is neither this extreme nor that extreme. We will use the Quran and Ahlul Bayt on one hand and our reasoning and intellect on one hand, and we will find a way to modernize and to adopt change and improve ourselves without betraying our loyalty to the Quran and Hadith and the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. But we need to have the right understanding of the importance of these values. So inshallah we will try and highlight these tomorrow night and see the challenges that Muslims face, Shia and Sunni, particularly those living in the West. And then whatever is left over, inshallah, we will tie as loose ends in our final lecture on Monday, inshallah. If you can recite aloud salawat ala Muhammad wa ala